The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Clarence's house, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Camilla stood at the edge of the drawing room, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a piece of paper that had arrived with the morning post. The official letterhead at the top made her stomach twist with a familiar dread. She had always known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were two entirely different things. After years of standing beside Charles through countless public appearances, private struggles, and the weight of royal duty, she was about to face the most challenging moment of their relationship. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Camilla quickly folded the letter, tucking it into the pocket of her cream-colored jacket. Charles appeared in the doorway, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. He wore the expression she had come to recognize over the years, the careful mask he put on when dealing with matters of state or family obligations. "Good morning, darling," he said, though his voice carried an unusual tension. "I trust you slept well?" Camilla nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had barely slept at all, actually. The conversation they had shared the previous evening had left her mind racing with possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Charles had mentioned receiving a call from his private secretary, something about urgent matters that required immediate attention. "Charles," she began, then stopped herself. How did one begin a conversation that might change everything? "About last night. What you mentioned." He moved closer, his eyes searching her face with the intensity that had first drawn her to him all those years ago. "Camilla, we need to talk. There are things happening. Decisions that must be made. And I cannot proceed without being completely honest with you." The weight of his words settled between them like a heavy curtain. Camilla felt her heart begin to race, though she tried to maintain her composure. She had survived scandals, public scrutiny, and the complex dynamics of the royal family. Surely she could handle whatever Charles was about to tell her. "Perhaps we should sit," she suggested, gesturing toward the elegant sofa where they had shared so many quiet moments over the years. The morning sun highlighted the delicate patterns in the fabric, patterns she had helped choose when they had first made this place their home together. Charles remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the way he did when addressing crowds or making official statements. This formal posture in their private space sent a chill through Camilla that had nothing to do with the morning air. "The call I received yesterday," he began slowly. "It was about the succession planning. The palace has been conducting reviews, preparing for various scenarios. Given recent events, given the changes in public sentiment, there are recommendations being made." Camilla felt the blood drain from her face. She had always understood that her position was unique, complicated by their history and the public's memory of Diana, but they had weathered so much together, had found their place within the intricate web of royal protocol and expectation. "What kind of recommendations?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles turned away from her, walking to the window where he could look out at the gardens they had cultivated together. "There are those who believe that for the stability of the monarchy, for the smooth transition of power, certain adjustments need to be made." The word adjustments hung in the air like a threat. Camilla rose from the sofa, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "Charles, you're frightening me. Please, just tell me what this is about." He turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, Camilla saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than any public scandal or media attack ever had. It was resignation. The look of a man who had already made a decision he didn't want to make. "They want me to consider the possibility of ruling alone, at least initially. The argument is that it would simplify matters, reduce potential controversies, and allow for a cleaner transition when the time comes." Camilla felt the room spin slightly around her. She reached for the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. "Are you saying they want you to set aside our marriage? Our partnership?" "Not set aside," Charles said quickly, taking a step toward her. "Nothing so dramatic, but perhaps a more private arrangement. You would remain important to me, of course, but your public role might need to be reconsidered." 1. The letter in her pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Camilla pulled it out with shaking hands and held it toward Charles. "I received something this morning as well. Perhaps you should read it." Charles took the letter, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. Camilla watched his face change as he read, saw the color drain from his cheeks, saw his jaw tighten with an anger she rarely witnessed. "This is unconscionable," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They had no right to contact you directly about this matter." "So you knew?" Camilla asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You knew they were going to approach me separately?" "I knew there were discussions," Charles admitted, crushing the letter in his fist. "But I never imagined they would be so presumptuous as to outline specific arrangements without consulting me first." Camilla sank into the chair she had been gripping for support. The letter had contained details that Charles's careful words had not fully conveyed. There were suggestions about maintaining separate residences, limiting her appearances at state functions, and gradually reducing her public profile. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, a systematic dismantling of the life they had built together. "How long have you known?" she asked. "How long have you been considering this?" Charles's silence was answer enough. Camilla felt something break inside her chest, a sharp pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. The man she loved, the man she had waited for and fought for, and stood beside through everything, had been contemplating a future without her, and hadn't found the courage to tell her, until forced by circumstances. "I thought we were partners," she whispered. "I thought, after everything we had been through, after all the battles we had fought together, that we were in this for life." "We are," Charles said, but his words lacked conviction. "Camilla, this doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't change what we mean to each other. Doesn't it?" she asked, looking up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "If you can consider putting the crown before our marriage, before our vows, then what exactly do we mean to each other?" The question hung between them, heavy with years of history, and hope, and hurt. Outside, the gardeners were beginning their morning work, tending to the roses that had always been Camilla's particular pride. She wondered if she would still be here to see them bloom this year, or if by then she would be relegated to the margins of Charles's life, a footnote to his reign rather than a partner in it. Charles moved toward her, reaching out as if to touch her face, but Camilla pulled back. The gesture was instinctive, protective, and she saw how it hurt him. Good, she thought with a flash of anger that surprised her. Let him feel even a fraction of what she was experiencing. "I need time to think," she said, rising from the chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "I need to understand what this really means, not just the careful words and diplomatic language, but what this actually means for us." "Camilla, please," Charles began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "No," she said firmly. "You've had time to think about this. Time to discuss it with advisors and palace officials and whoever else gets a say in our private life. Now I need my time." She walked past him toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "I always knew that loving you would require sacrifices. I accepted that long ago. But I never thought the ultimate sacrifice would be you choosing the crown over choosing me." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the morning quiet. Charles stood alone in the drawing room, surrounded by the life they had built together, holding the crumpled remains of a letter that had just changed everything. 3 days had passed since the conversation that had shattered the carefully constructed piece of their morning routine. Camilla found herself walking the grounds of their estate, seeking solace in the familiar paths she had wandered countless times before. But now, even the gardens felt different, as if the very earth beneath her feet had shifted. She paused beside the rose garden, remembering the afternoon they had planned it together. Charles had been so enthusiastic about the heritage varieties, the ones that had historical significance to the royal estates. She had teased him about his passion for tradition, never imagining that same reverence for protocol would one day threaten to tear them apart. Her mobile phone buzzed in her pocket, and she saw Charles's name on the screen. It had been buzzing regularly for the past 3 days, but she hadn't been ready to answer. Each time it rang, she felt that same sharp pain in her chest, the one that had taken up permanent residence since their conversation. This time, however, she answered, "Camilla." Charles's voice was heavy with relief. "Thank goodness. I was beginning to worry that you had left entirely." "I'm still here," she said simply, settling onto a wooden bench that faced the ornamental pond. Though I'm not sure for how long. There was silence on the other end of the line, and Camilla could picture Charles in his study, probably surrounded by the official papers and correspondence that seemed to multiply daily as his responsibilities grew heavier. "We need to talk," he said finally. "Properly this time. There have been developments, and I want you to hear them from me, before anyone else has the chance to reach you." Camilla closed her eyes, feeling the late afternoon sun warm on her face. "More letters? More recommendations about how to manage the inconvenient problem of your wife?" "Camilla, please." Charles's voice carried a note of pain that almost softened her resolve. "It's not like that. It's never been about you being a problem. You must know that." "Must I?" she asked. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it seems very much like that's exactly what this is about. The palace machine has decided that I'm too complicated, too controversial, and they've found a way to convince you that the monarchy would be better served if I simply stepped back into the shadows." She could hear Charles breathing on the other end of the line, could sense his struggle with words that had never come easily to him when emotions ran high. "Will you come back to the house?" he asked. "There are people here who want to speak with you, to explain the full situation. I think you deserve to hear all of it, before making any decisions." Camilla laughed, but there was no humor in it. "People want to speak with me? Let me guess. Your private secretary? Perhaps a representative from the palace? Maybe someone from the press office? All very concerned about my welfare, I'm sure, while they explain why my marriage needs to be sacrificed for the greater good." End quote. "That's not fair," Charles said, his voice sharpening with frustration. "These are people who care about both of us, who want to find a solution that works for everyone." "Everyone except me, apparently," Camilla replied. "Charles, do you remember our wedding day? Do you remember the promises we made to each other?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. She could hear him moving, probably walking to the window of his study where he could look out toward the gardens where she was sitting. "Of course I remember," he said softly. "Every word." "Then perhaps you should consider whether those promises were conditional," she said. "Whether they came with fine print about royal succession and public opinion and political convenience." Camilla ended the call before he could respond, then immediately turned off her phone. She needed silence, needed space to think, without the constant pressure of other people's expectations and demands. The truth was, she had always known this possibility existed, even during their happiest moments. Even when they had seemed to find their rhythm as a couple, within the complex structure of royal life, there had been an underlying awareness that their relationship existed at the pleasure of forces much larger than themselves. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were entirely different things. She had allowed herself to believe that their love, their partnership, their shared commitment to duty and service, would be enough to weather any storm. She had been naive, perhaps, but she had been hopeful. Now, as the sun began to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, Camilla felt the weight of all the years she had spent building a life that could be dismantled so easily by people who had never asked her what she wanted. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text message from her daughter, Laura. "Mom, are you all right? Charles called looking for you. He sounds worried." Camilla smiled despite everything. Her children had been her anchor through every storm, the one constant in a life that had been shaped by public scrutiny and private heartbreak. They had supported her decision to marry Charles, had welcomed him into their family despite the complications his presence brought to their lives. She typed back quickly, "I'm fine, darling. Just need some time to think. We'll call you later." But was she fine? Camilla wasn't sure she even knew what that meant anymore. For years, she had defined herself in relation to Charles, to his needs, his duties, his future. She had adapted her own life to fit into the spaces left by his royal obligations. She had learned to smile at events where she felt unwelcome, had developed a thick skin against criticism that felt deeply personal, had found ways to be useful and valuable despite starting from a position of disadvantage. And now, all of that adaptation, All of that careful navigation of an impossible situation was being presented to her as temporary, conditional, subject to change based on the political calculations of people who had never had to live with the consequences of their decisions. As darkness began to fall, Camilla made her way back toward the house. Drawn by the warm light spilling from the windows, she could see Charles moving around in his study, and part of her wanted to go to him, to find a way to work through this crisis, as they had worked through so many others. But another part of her, a part that had been growing stronger over the past 3 days, wondered if this was the moment to finally put herself first, to consider what she wanted, what she needed, what kind of life she could build if she stopped trying to fit into a role that might never truly be hers. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Charles stepped out into the evening air. He was still wearing his formal clothes from whatever meetings had filled his day, but his tie was loosened, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. "You turned off your phone," he said. Not quite an accusation, but close to one. "I needed quiet," Camilla replied, stopping a few feet away from him. Something that seems to be in short supply these days. They stood looking at each other across the space that seemed to contain all the years of their relationship. The good and the bad. The public and the private. The love and the complications that had always defined what they meant to each other. "The people I mentioned," Charles said carefully. "They've gone home for the evening. But they'll be back tomorrow morning. They want to present some options, some alternatives to what was outlined in that letter you received." "Options," Camilla repeated. "How generous of them to provide me with choices about my own life." Charles flinched at the bitterness in her voice. "Camilla, I know this is difficult. I know it seems like decisions are being made without your input. But that's not what's happening here. Your voice matters. Your feelings matter." "Do they?" she asked. "Because it seems to me that my voice has been notably absent from these conversations, until very recently. It seems to me that plans were being made, recommendations were being developed, and solutions were being crafted, all without anyone bothering to ask what I might want." The accusation hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Charles looked down at his hands, and Camilla could see that she had hit her mark. Whatever meetings had been taking place, whatever advice he had been receiving, she had indeed been discussed rather than consulted. "I should have handled this differently," he admitted. "I should have come to you first, should have made sure you were part of every conversation from the beginning." "Yes," Camilla said simply. "You should have." The acknowledgement should have felt like a victory, but instead, it just made her feel tired. She was exhausted by the constant need to fight for her place, to prove her worth, to justify her existence in his life and in his world. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do we go inside and pretend that everything is fine until your advisors return tomorrow? Do we play house while they decide whether our marriage is compatible with your future as king?" Charles stepped closer, his eyes searching her face in the dim light from the house. "What happens now is that we remember who we are to each other. What happens now is that we figure out how to fight this together instead of letting it tear us apart." For a moment, Camilla felt her resolve waver. The man standing before her was the same one who had loved her through decades of separation and scandal, who had waited for her and fought for her when it would have been easier to choose someone else. But he was also the man who had spent the last several days considering a future that relegated her to the margins of his life. "I'm not sure I know how to do that anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The morning meeting began precisely at 9 o'clock, as royal protocol demanded. Camilla sat beside Charles in his formal reception room, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her expression composed despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. Across from them sat 3 representatives from the palace: Charles's private secretary, a constitutional expert, and a senior advisor whose job seemed to be managing difficult situations with diplomatic precision. The constitutional expert, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, opened a leather portfolio and began explaining the various precedents for royal marriages during times of succession uncertainty. His voice was dry and academic, as if they were discussing historical figures rather than the woman sitting 3 feet away from him. "The key consideration," he was saying, "is the stability of the institution during the transition period. Public confidence must be maintained, and any potential sources of controversy need to be carefully managed. Camilla felt Charles tense beside her at the word controversy, but she remained perfectly still. She had learned long ago that showing emotion during these formal discussions only provided ammunition for those who wanted to portray her as unsuitable or unstable. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. "I've read the letter with your preliminary recommendations, but I'd like to hear the details spoken aloud." The senior advisor leaned forward, his expression carefully sympathetic. "Your Royal Highness, we want to emphasize that these are simply options for your consideration. Nothing has been decided, and your comfort and well-being are paramount in any decisions that are made." "How reassuring," Camilla replied with just a hint of steel in her voice. "Please, continue." The advisor cleared his throat. "The first option would involve maintaining your current role, but with certain modifications to your schedule and public appearances. This would allow for a gradual adjustment period while preserving the stability of your marriage." "And the second option?" Charles asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The second option would involve a more significant restructuring," the private secretary interjected. "Your Royal Highness would maintain her titles and her marriage, but would step back from most public duties to allow His Royal Highness to establish his reign without complications." Camilla felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. "When you say, step back, what exactly does that mean? Are we talking about occasional absences, or are we talking about a complete withdrawal from public life?" The three men exchanged glances, and Camilla saw the answer in their hesitation. The constitutional expert cleared his throat again. Complete withdrawal would not be necessary, but a substantial reduction in visibility would be advisable, perhaps limiting appearances to family events and very select charitable engagements. "I see," Camilla said quietly. "And the third option? Because surely you've prepared multiple alternatives for such an important decision." Quote, another pause. The senior advisor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The third option would involve a formal separation of roles while maintaining the marriage. His Royal Highness would rule alone, and you would be free to pursue your own interests without the constraints of royal protocol." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla could feel Charles's eyes on her, could sense his internal struggle between his duty to the crown and his loyalty to their marriage. "These are all very interesting academic exercises," Camilla said finally, "but I notice that none of them involve asking what I actually want, or what I think would be best for the monarchy, or what my decades of experience in royal life might contribute to this discussion." The private secretary looked genuinely puzzled. "Of course your preferences matter, Your Royal Highness. That's why we're here, to discuss your options." Camilla laughed, a sound that held no amusement. "You're here to present me with predetermined choices, each of which involves me sacrificing various aspects of my life for the convenience of other people. You're not here to ask for my input on how we might solve this problem together." "Camilla," Charles said quietly, speaking for the first time since the formal presentations had begun, "what do you want?" The question was simple, but it hit her like a physical blow. What did she want? For years, she had defined her wants in relation to Charles's needs, had shaped her desires around what was possible within the constraints of their unique situation. Now, faced with the possibility of losing it all anyway, she found herself considering what her life might look like if she stopped trying to fit into someone else's vision of what she should be. "I want to matter," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want my experience and my perspective and my dedication to be valued, rather than seen as obstacles to be managed. I want to be a partner, not a complication." The constitutional expert began to speak, but Camilla held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," she continued. "I want to know that the man I married sees me as an asset to his reign, not a liability. I want to know that when difficult decisions need to be made, he thinks of us as a team, rather than thinking of me as someone who needs to be protected from the consequences of his choices." She turned to look directly at Charles, ignoring the other men in the room entirely. "Most of all, I want to know that our marriage means the same thing to you that it means to me. Because if it doesn't, if you can sit in meetings where my future is planned without my input and not see anything wrong with that, then perhaps these gentlemen are right." Perhaps we do need to reconsider what we mean to each other. Charles met her gaze, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. She could see the young man who had first told her he loved her. The one who had waited decades for the chance to marry her. The one who had promised her that they would face whatever came next together. "Gentlemen," he said without looking away from Camilla, "I think we need to reschedule this discussion. My wife and I need to have a private conversation. Before any decisions are made." The three men began to protest, mentioning urgent timelines and the need for immediate clarity. But Charles stood up with the authority that only came from a lifetime of royal training. "I said we need to reschedule," he repeated, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "You'll have our answer when we're ready to give it. Not before." After the advisors left, grumbling about constitutional deadlines and political pressures, Charles and Camilla sat in silence for several long minutes. The formal room felt different now, less like a place where their fate was being decided by others, and more like the home they had created together. "I'm sorry," Charles said finally. "I'm sorry for letting them speak about you as if you weren't in the room. I'm sorry for participating in discussions about our marriage without insisting that you be part of them from the beginning." Camilla nodded, but she could feel tears beginning to build behind her eyes. "I know you are. But Charles, sorry doesn't fix the fact that this happened at all. Sorry doesn't address the fact that when faced with pressure from the establishment, your instinct was to consider sacrificing our partnership rather than fighting for it. That's not what happened," Charles protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Camilla asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks very much like that's exactly what happened. The palace suggested that I was a problem, and instead of rejecting that premise entirely, you started looking for ways to minimize the problem." Charles stood up and walked to the window, his shoulders carrying the weight of a conversation he clearly didn't want to have but couldn't avoid any longer. "The crown isn't just about what I want," he said. "It's about duty, about serving something larger than myself. Sometimes that means making personal sacrifices for the greater good." "And I'm one of those sacrifices?" Camilla asked. He turned back to face her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "You're the most important thing in my life, but you're also the most complicated thing in my life. And sometimes I don't know how to protect both you and the institution I'm meant to serve." The honesty of his answer hit her like a slap. It was what she had suspected but hadn't wanted to face, that even after all these years, even after all they had been through together, he still saw her as a complication to be managed rather than a partner to be valued. "I can't live like that anymore," she said quietly. "I can't spend the rest of my life being your beautiful complication, wondering when the next crisis will come that makes you question whether our marriage is worth defending." "Camilla, please," Charles said, moving toward her. "Don't make any decisions in anger. This situation, these pressures, they won't last forever, won't they?" she asked. "Charles, you're going to be king. These pressures, these impossible choices between your personal life and your public duty, they're not going to get easier. They're going to get harder. And if you're already wavering now, what happens when the stakes are even higher?" She stood up, smoothing her skirt with hands that were steadier than she felt. "I need time to think. Real time. Away from this house, away from the advisors and the protocols, and the constant reminders of what I'm supposed to sacrifice next." "Where will you go?" Charles asked, his voice small and lost. "I don't know yet," Camilla admitted. "But I know I can't stay here while you decide whether our marriage is compatible with your crown. I won't sit quietly while other people determine my worth or my future." She walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle, just as she had 3 days earlier. But this time, when she turned back to look at Charles, she saw something different in his eyes. Not resignation, but panic. Not duty, but desperation. "I love you," he said, the words coming out rushed and urgent. "Whatever else happens, whatever decisions we make, I love you more than I've ever loved anyone or anything." Camilla felt her heart break a little more, because she believed him completely and knew that it wasn't going to be enough. "I love you too," she replied. "But love without trust, without partnership, without the certainty that we're on the same side when things get difficult, That's not enough to build a life on. Not anymore. The door closed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. Charles stood alone in the reception room, surrounded by the chairs where men had sat and discussed dismantling his marriage with the same clinical precision they might use to discuss tax policy or trade agreements. For the first time since he was a child, he found himself wondering if the crown was worth the price it demanded. But by the time the question fully formed in his mind, the sound of Camilla's footsteps had already faded, and he was left with only the ticking of the clock and the weight of choices that might have already been made for him.